Hello there, and thanks for joining me for another episode of Let's Chat. I'm Claire Sands, host of the Silent Why podcast and blog writer for thesilentwhy.com, a podcast that explores how and where we can find hope in loss and grief. In these Let's Chat episodes, I talk to a guest who has experience or expertise in a particular area of loss. And I'm really excited about this episode's guest because it's fellow podcaster and writer Justin Creps. Justin is also a teacher and lives in Ohio, where he co-hosts the podcast Writing in Progress with John Woolley, and that's how I first came across him. Justin and I share a love for two things, podcasting and writing. He's also a fantastic runner, which is where our shared interests come to a screeching halt. But that didn't stop me wanting to also explore how that's helped him through grief as well. A while back, Justin shared a deeply personal blog post with me, one he wrote in 2022 about how both running and writing had helped him navigate the grief of his wife's miscarriage. His story was such a powerful reminder of how we all process loss in our own ways, and I knew I had to invite him on the podcast to talk about it. In this conversation, we dive into writing as a tool for healing, whether through fiction or non-fiction, the creative processes we both enjoy, and how life's hardest moments can shape us as writers. We also explore the surprising ways that helping others can in turn help us through our own struggles. It's a very honest, vulnerable conversation, and I can't wait for you to hear it. And with each of these types of episode, I aim to capture a little bit of wisdom from every conversation, kind of like the Hermans in our usual episodes. You need to pop to thehermancompany.com for more on that one. So to do that, I'm building a metaphorical tool shed filled with resources to help us navigate grief and loss. And at the end of each episode, I ask my guest what kind of tool their insight represents, and I add it to the shed. And so far, I've gathered a really valuable collection, which I will get a list of onto the website as soon as I get round to it. So grab a cup of tea, a coffee, or maybe a sports drink of some kind, and relax with me and Justin as we chat writing and running through grief.
I'm Justin Creps, aspiring author. My main job is I'm a teacher, but I do very much enjoy writing on the side. I live in Ohio. Yeah, I grew up in a town called Toledo. It's up in northwest Ohio, and now I'm about 2 or 3 hours south of there in Columbus, just kind of from the heartland in the United States. And I started a podcast a few years ago with my fellow teacher, John Woolley, and that's how Claire and I kind of connected. So we record an episode maybe once or twice a month and put it out there. And I wrote a blog a few years ago about a life experience I had, and it lined up with a lot of what Claire does here on the Silent Why. So we'd kind of become podcast friends. So I shared it with her, and she invited me on.
And you're the guest today. How does it feel to be the guest rather than the host?
It's funny. I feel a little nervous because my guests always talk about being nervous, and when you're the host, I'm never really that nervous because I guess I know the questions and stuff ahead of time. But yeah, I'm interested to see where this goes. It's kind of fun not knowing.
And you don't get the editing afterwards. That's my job, so you can relax.
I'm very excited about that. Sometimes on my end, the editing can be a pain. There's a lot of behind the scenes stuff when it comes to like syncing audio, and sometimes it goes smoothly and it's no problem. But every once in a while, you get a kind of tricky piece of audio that can turn into a lot of work rather quickly.
Definitely. When I first started, I thought editing an hour interview would be like roughly an hour and a bit because you're listening to an hour, right? And you're just doing a little bit as you go. I did not think it was going to be maybe 3-4 times the length of the episode to get it right. So yeah, there's a lot of work goes in. So hats off to you for doing that.
Oh, and to you.
Thank you. You do a podcast called Writing in Progress with John Woolley. We have to give a shout out to John.
Oh yeah, John's great.
Co-host in your writing mission. There was something I picked out from the blog that you did that I'll talk about in a bit. You said there's 2 mediums that are hardwired to my emotional core, running and writing. And I don't know anything about the first one, but I do know a little bit about the second, and that's how we connected. How did writing and running, what sort of age did they come into your life? How far back do these two go?
Quite a ways, actually. So running started way back. Gosh, I was probably in about 6th grade. So I think that would make me like maybe 12 years old. And I was really into soccer or football, where you guys are from, right? And I was never the most skilled. I had decent skill. I'm a very competitive person. I want to be good at the things I do. And I knew to be good at soccer, I just had to be really fast and fit. And I would just basically outwork people. So what was kind of the natural extension of that was I'm going to start running. So I would run outside of practice so that when I got on the soccer field, I knew I could just outrun whoever I was matched up against. And then along the way, I kind of became pretty good at running. My second sport was track and field, and I started doing that in 7th grade. And yeah, I was pretty good at the 800 meter, which is about half a mile, a little under a K for you guys. That kind of took me into the world of running. And as I got into college, I found that I liked having something to train for, a goal to strive for, and kind of just the way my personality is, it was like, okay, I guess the marathon's the next thing to do. So I went from the 800 meter up to the marathon, which was quite a jump. And there was a lot of learning that went along with that. But yeah, it started when I was pretty young, and writing was actually, funny enough, right around the same time. In 6th grade, I had a teacher named Mrs. Carroll, and she assigned us a short story, I don't know, assignment. And I remember a lot of kids in my class wrote a page or two. We had like the weekend to write it, and I came back on Monday with like 12 pages, which for a 6th grader, and I just kind of realized at that moment, like, I have a pretty active imagination, and it's fun to kind of let it turn into a story.
I love it when there's a teacher early on that just sparks
Mhm.
that creative passion in somebody. I hope they find out sometimes that they did that, because it must be such a big thing for them. And what sort of writing do you enjoy most? Because we sort of connected roundabout around a short story competition called Writing Battle, which I heard about. I think I heard about it on your podcast. I must have heard about your podcast before the competition. So I entered in a couple of those with a really short, like 250 word, 500 word. But you guys have been doing that for a lot longer than I'd even known about it. What sort of length is your favorite kind of type of writing?
It kind of depends, honestly. Again, I like competition and stuff, so that seems to bring out the best in me. So it's kind of whatever I get prompted that weekend, it's got to be my favorite. But yeah, I think I've found after the fact, after it's done, I do like having a longer piece. So I guess in the moment, I kind of approach them all the same. So like Writer's Playground, which is another one we do, is a longer one. It's 3,000 words. And I do find myself kind of liking those stories more when I'm done with them, because I had more time to kind of dive in and go places with it. When I do write unprompted, which these days isn't all that often just because it's hard to find time to do it, it seems like a lot of my stories end up in kind of that 3 to 5,000 kind of word area. A lot of my blogs I don't blog that often anymore either, but I think they kind of end up in around that area as well. So the longer stuff, obviously, it's more work in the moment, but when you're done with it, you kind of have a bigger thing to be proud of, maybe.
Yeah, and I think it's a lot of work, because I'm probably the exact opposite of you. I like having a go at the 250. That feels like a challenge. Or I want like 90,000. I don't really the bit in between feels like a lot of work. I mean 3,500, that is difficult, I think, to fit in the full structure of a story and to do it well. To me feels like so few words. That's what I found really interesting about this. I just discovered this short story world, which I'd never really come across before.
Right.
To hear how all the different people, especially on your podcast, like all the different lengths of story. And I'm learning that there's such a different skill to doing a short story than there is to doing a novel. They're not the same set of skills. When I try and put my hand of what I know about novel writing to a 250 or a 500 or a 1,000, it doesn't work. It's just there's not enough words to do the same kind of thing. So yeah, I've got a lot of admiration for people who do all the different lengths, because that is very difficult. And for most people who don't know, most people listening probably won't know that a lot of these competitions, it's not just a case of writing a story. You're given a genre to write to, or you're given a prompt, which might be a character or a setting or an object or something. So you're writing to very specific things, and the art of it is to be creative, I guess, within that genre and around those prompts, which again was new for me and I found really challenging. I love the idea of it, but in practice, in the first 5 minutes of getting them, you're like, oh, this is exciting. And then like an hour later, I'm like, this is really hard. So yeah, is it something that comes easily to you?
I guess it kind of does. I think I tend to be a little bit of a rambler, which you might realize when you're editing this episode. So I think kind of having that constraint and forcing myself actively to budget my words, for lack of a better phrase, kind of forces me to stay on topic, stay focused, and I'm less likely to veer off into something that's not that relevant to the story. I have tried my hand. I do have a manuscript that I'm going to revisit someday. That's very, very long. And I know even from the few times I've kind of revisited over the years, there's a lot of stuff that leaked in there that's just like me personally venting through my characters. And now that I'm looking at it with new eyes and maybe some better trained eyes from doing all of these competitions and writing, I'm like, okay, yeah, that's not that relevant. That was me writing for myself rather than writing for the story, which is still good and sometimes needed. But I think there's something to be said for learning to kind of tell the difference between, what's something I wrote because I wanted to write about it that day, and what's a scene that was actually moving the story forward.
Yeah, definitely. I think I've learnt that over the years. I've had a novel that I've been working on. I'm getting there. But yeah, I've definitely had to rewrite bits that have been me processing life, really. But when I reread it, it needs a different voice. It needs a different take on it. And like you said, it's a great place to start.
Yeah.
But it's not the finishing thing if you want to sort of take it any further. And I think that's a real interesting part of my writing journey, has been learning the difference between just writing something to get something out of you and then actually making it into something that other people
Yes.
will want to read, or that has a good structure to it. But yeah, I don't get to talk about writing very often on the podcast, so I don't want to get too waylaid with that side of it. But that is the important bit, and I think it really comes together. And what we're going to talk about with you, I think, brings together in such a lovely way grief, loss, running, how writing can help with processing these things. And it all started with a blog that you shared with me that was just like, I mean, I don't want to sound too excited about it because it is a sad subject, isn't it? You're processing something very deep. But for me, it was very exciting because I was just like, this is so well written, because you are an incredibly good writer.
Thank you.
You're not just on here because you write. You write very good stories, and you can tell that through the blog. There's a few bits I'll pull out that I just thought that's how you can see your writing skill. It's really well written. I mean, there's a lot about running in it, which I don't know, so I learned a lot about that. But I loved how you kind of dovetailed that with a particular grief that you were going through at the time in 2021. So do you want to just, in your words, just tell us a bit about what that blog was and how that came about?
Sure. So the blog, and I'm actually not super familiar with blog terminology. There's the big blog with all the articles, and that is a running blog. That's my running blog. I used to write in it quite a bit. I've actually kind of not written in it as much the last few years, but then you have the specific articles, and it's actually funny looking back at the blog. The last 3 articles are actually all me like processing difficult things. So it's kind of turned into that.
Yeah.
It went from like a running blog to a running slash Justin's dealing with emotions blog. But the one I sent you was a pretty heavy one. Inarguably, probably the greatest loss that I've experienced. So my wife and I had our first child in 2020. His name's Mac. He's now 4 years old. He's great. Afterwards, we went on a vacation one summer. It was our first time away as parents without our kid, which when you become a parent, you start to value those trips a little more. And yeah, we had a bit of a surprise. We found out we were pregnant, and it was scary in the moment because we were not planning to have a second child that quickly. And so we kind of allowed ourselves, there's something you're kind of told when you become a parent of like, especially that first trimester, like, don't get too excited almost, because things happen. Doesn't always go the way you want it to go. So you kind of temper that expectation. But this time, because we were already feeling nervous and stuff, we almost leaned the other way intentionally of let's get excited about this. So we just really started kind of talking ourselves into this is a good thing. It wasn't the plan, but that's okay. This is great. And also growing up and even as a young man, I was nervous to become a father, just to be honest. And so I think in some ways when Melissa, my wife, was pregnant with Mac, I had some feelings of what's this going to be like? Am I going to be a good dad? And, I was very nervous about it, and that was all going on during 2020, which had plenty of other things to worry and be anxious about as well. But then we had Mac, and I found out I loved it. And I am a good dad, and it is just this great blessing. So this second child, when we were expecting it, I was fully excited. I was all in a way I wasn't even with my first child. And because it was 2020 with Mac, I wasn't allowed to go to the ultrasounds or any of those doctor's meetings because they were very strict on how many people could be in the doctor's office and all that stuff during COVID. So the second time around, I was allowed to go, and it was the first time I got to hear my child's heartbeat, and I never got to do that with Mac. But very quickly, it was actually that first appointment. I got to hear the heartbeat. It was great, but then like right away, the doctor was like, something's not right. They're not measuring the right size. And there was definitely a period of denial. And then pretty quickly after that, we realized we were going to lose the baby. And that was hard, obviously. And I think because I had let myself get so excited and I had gotten in the mindset of let yourself get excited, take off all the reins, feel all the things, it hit very hard. And I'm not always great at processing those emotions, but through running and through writing, that's kind of when I was able to do it. And writing, I think, makes sense, right? You're vulnerable as a writer. Your emotions go into what you write. Just that's kind of how we do it. At least how I do it. I think that's probably how most people do it. So that one kind of makes sense. Running might be harder to explain, and I'm not sure if I can completely articulate it. I think part of it's just being alone. You're out on your own. There's no one there that you have to put up a front or pretend like things are okay. And I don't know, for me, running has always been an emotional thing. It's part of what makes me a good runner is I let myself get all fired up, and when you're in the 25th mile of a marathon, it's emotional. It's an emotional experience, like, the physical part of your body isn't really working anymore. You have to rely on your heart making it that last mile or so. So, I think for whatever reason, I'm in an emotional state when I'm running often, so yeah, there were some workouts where I was literally, like, running and crying, and that little part of my day each day was where I let myself feel all the things, and it was an important part of the grieving process for me.
I remember you mentioned one place in particular, I can't remember the name of it, where you had that moment of just like running and crying and you're in the dark. Do you think do you think you would have processed it in the same way if you hadn't have had something like that for that outlet?
It's kinda hard to say. I think it's I think it's kinda like, plugging a hole with water rushing. It's gonna come out somewhere, I don't think you can bottle that up forever. So who knows? It might have come out in a negative way,
Mm.
could it have turned into, resentment at home? Could it have come out in my workplace if I'm irritable? And I think having that outlet of place to feel the things and let the grief go, running was really important for that because I don't know. I can't say how it would have come out. I like to think I would have found a healthy way to, to deal with it. But I do think I would say with certainty it would have come out in some form or fashion somewhere.
Yeah.
So, using it to get emotional and run extra fast and run a little further and work a little harder is probably a pretty positive way to use those emotions. So I think that's a good way of doing it for me.
It's interesting, especially when you said running's emotional for you. When you allow yourself to get emotional about anything in any way, I think that does allow other emotions to come through. Maybe that's a really key important thing, especially for men, I think, because men don't talk about these things as much as women do with each other. They're often afraid of showing some form of weakness, in inverted commas. And also, especially around babies, miscarriages, IVF, heard a lot of people say quite often, even the medical profession will look to the female to support the female, to support what they're going through. And it can be very easy for the male to be ignored. And then therefore the grief doesn't come out, or they're supporting the wife going through something physical. So they sort of shut down what they're feeling a little bit to try and be strong. But interesting that you've already got an outlet there for emotions. I wonder if that helps it out. I don't know. I mean, I think most women will understand, like, if you're feeling in a particularly fragile place and you start laughing a lot, sometimes it will just make you cry. It's very
Sure.
confusing. But sometimes
Yeah.
there's like, you let out one emotion and another one like hijacks it and was like, oh, quick, we're being emotional. Actually, we're sad about something. So yeah, that's really interesting. It's making me really think about the different ways of processing stuff like that. And in your blog, you talk very specifically about the training leading up to this one marathon. Was it
Columbus. Yep.
Columbus? Yeah, that's it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And you've named your daughter Logan in the blog. It's actually just let's ask you about that. Do you think it helped naming her and then making her into something that was with you on that run?
Yeah. So the place we visited, the little town we stayed in, it's in an area of Ohio called Hocking Hills. It's a really lovely place with lots of rolling hills and forests, and there's all these cabins and caves you can walk through. And but the town we stayed in was called Logan, Ohio. So we were, like I said, normally, and I don't know what's normal. It's different for everyone, I suppose. But I remember even with Mac, we waited till we were done with the first trimester before we even started talking about names because you don't want to get too attached, right? Because things can go wrong. But that's actually a perfect example of, in this case, we were like, let's pick a name, like let's get excited. It was this scary thing we weren't planning on, so let's find things to get excited about. And so we were talking about names, and we hadn't completely decided on one prior to this, but one of the names we talked about was Logan, after the place where the baby was conceived. We also, frankly, didn't know for sure if it was going to be a boy or a girl yet. We were hoping for a girl because our first kid was a boy. But kind of in pretty quickly after the fact, once we knew we had lost Logan. We knew we were going to hope for another child, which we have had another child since, but we knew we were never going to use the name Logan again. So to me, that was a name that it helped me, I think, to, I guess giving it a name made it feel real, which allowed me to process the loss more. And I don't know. I'm not an expert in loss and grief if that was a healthy way to deal with it or not. But to me, it seemed to help. So I think that's all we can do in those moments is do what is best for us. I'm sure it's different for everyone. And my wife swears, she's very convinced it was going to be a girl, which I'm not gonna question that. Yeah, to us, it's a little girl named Logan. And yeah, I don't know, processing it. I talk about it in the blog. There were days where I pretended I was running with her. And maybe that's weird. Maybe people are listening to this and like, man, this dude's crazy. But to me, it allowed me to exist alongside that grief, process it, be with it. I think that's an important part of dealing with it is letting yourself feel it and feel all the things. And maybe I think in loss with something like this, there's an element of what if, of not knowing, that kind of unknown part of it is one of the biggest things that's hard to deal with. So by giving her a name, felt like I knew her, kind of took out that unknown bit a little bit,
Mm,
even if it was just for me personally,
yeah.
which helped. It helped me.
I think that makes a lot of sense. I actually think that because my audience are mostly people been through grief and loss, they take anything that anybody does to get through it because that's all you can do, isn't it?
Right.
And actually, I think that's really healthy. And I've heard it, even in like the sort of more childless world, which is obviously sort of where I'm sort of based, that actually it's really difficult grieving something there's no substance to at all because it was never there. So if you're in a situation like us where you never even had a pregnancy test that was positive, you've got nothing specific to grieve. And I didn't think about that for a long time, but I've since heard people who have literally made up their children and named them so that they have
Mm.
something to grieve. Like, oh, let's say we had 2 little girls and they were called this and this, and that's who we're grieving. And that can actually make you confront your grief a bit and really help get through it. So what you said, I think, makes a lot of sense. It puts substance in it, puts a person to what you've lost, which can be very difficult otherwise. And it was her name, one of the bits in your blog, that showed me the writer in you was like the structure bit that kept coming back, and I wrote them down because you were like, hey Logan, this is what it feels like to be alive. Hey Logan, this is what it feels like to be loved. Hey Logan, this is what it feels like to go fast. Hey Logan, I'm really glad we did this together. Hey Logan, we did it. And I was like, that's just brilliant. That's a story right there for me. There's a structure of you going through it and then connecting with her along the way and her being with you. And I think that's what makes the blog so special, is that you take us along on that journey with you and with her, which I think is just what a lovely tribute to her. When you hit publish on that blog, how were you feeling? Is that a really scary, vulnerable place for you? Or was this like, actually, this feels quite cathartic. This is good to put out there?
I think mostly the second thing. So it took me a long time to write it. That's another thing I think it's important. I ran the race in October. This isn't like I wrote this and published in November. Like it was like the following spring. But I think I mostly felt good about it. For me personally, I think it was a step. Like I'm comfortable talking about this now. I'm comfortable sharing. So one thing I think worth mentioning for sure is I definitely like followed my wife's lead because there is a female male when it comes to something like this. Like if my wife wasn't comfortable with me talking about this, I would not have talked about it.
Sure.
So for a long time we didn't talk too much about it. Pretty early in the process, once we had officially lost Logan, my wife did post something just to kind of let people know. And that's when I took it as it was okay for me to talk about it as well. So I remember not long after we lost her, I had a cross country meet. So I coach, and people were going to be at that meet seeing me who had seen my wife's post. So like they knew that we had just lost a child and we were feeling some really heavy emotions. And I think it would have been perfectly valid for me to say, oh, I'm not going to be at this meet. Have my assistant coach cover for me or whatever. But I wanted to keep kind of going, keep life normal, take my mind off of it for a little while. But what I didn't want was like people that I know at the meet coming up to me in that moment. Oh, I'm so sorry we hurt. I didn't want to deal with all that. So I just put out a message I'm very close with the families that I coach, and just was honest with them and told them what had happened, but also said, like, I don't want to talk about this today. Like, I'm here to coach the athletes and have a good meet, and I appreciate all the good feelings and stuff. And anyways, even from that, it spread around fairly quickly. When you're a teacher and a coach in a community like ours, people talk about you. Like, it's just, but what was cool was they respected us on that day, went fine. But in the ensuing weeks, I started to get more and more messages of, hey, I went through this and I just wanted to reach out, and people were very gracious and courteous and respectful. But it was eye-opening how many people had also been through it, and how much I learned from people who reached out to me. So there was one mom, her daughter runs for me, and she reached out, shared that they had lost a child through a miscarriage. And one of the healthiest thoughts she had afterwards, they ended up having another child who they would have never had if the miscarriage didn't happen, because they would have been done. So the only reason they have this new person that they love is because that miscarriage happened. And I guess now I'm in a very similar situation of, we have our second son, Parker, who I love that kid. I wouldn't change a thing about him. He wouldn't be here if Logan was. We would have been done. So I guess, I don't know if I would have found that thought on my own or if I would have found it as quickly. So I think having benefited from other people sharing their experiences with me, it made me very excited to, hey, if someone reads this and takes any positive out of it, then I've kind of paid it forward, and that's how I teach and that's how I coach. I am very much like an experience-driven coach. This kid's struggling with something, I'm going to talk about a time I struggled with something similarly, and hopefully they can learn through my experience. Like, that's just kind of how I am. So I'm pretty open about sharing things, and if someone else can benefit from my experiences, then that's a huge win. So yeah, I think having gone through it and felt the love from other people, it made me feel mostly positive and excited about. And excited's probably the wrong word, but it definitely made me feel mostly positive about sharing my experiences, in the hopes that someone else would read it and benefit.
Mm.
And I guess the other thing I would add is, I know my blog's not like a big blog that like thousands of people are going to read. Like, it's probably just going to be people who know me. Maybe some people from your podcast might read it now, and that's totally great. But there's a measure of comfort. It wasn't like it was going out on the internet for people on Reddit to rip apart or, call me weak or something. Anyone who would go to that link is someone who cares about me.
Yeah.
So it was going to be positive.
Yeah, that's nice. In my experience, sharing anything that you've been through that's hard has a positive response from other people, because I think it's just one of those things. People identify with hard stuff, with suffering, with bad things more than they do with the celebrations and the things that people achieve. I'm pretty sure, you sharing that with somebody, it makes a lot of people feel more comfortable than you're saying, I've run this many marathons, where people are like, oh, I can't even run like two. Like, it's like there's something good about identifying with the bad stuff that people really, really connect with. And I just can't get away from grief. Every time I've done a short story in any of these competitions, I've thought, oh, I'll try and do a funny one. I've never done funny. Let me try funny. By the time I finished it, it's back about grief again. I don't know what it is, but big emotions, they're fun. I find them enjoyable.
It's funny. I judged one of yours in writing battle
Did
once.
you?
And I didn't realize it at the time. And it actually was my favorite. I'm not even pulling your leg. It was my favorite of the stories I judged that season. I remember it was someone speaking at a conference.
Oh, that was the really short. That was the 250. Yeah.
Yeah. And I really enjoyed it. And I haven't read enough of your stuff to put it together. But when I saw in the debrief it was you, I was like, oh yeah, someone's speaking about grief. I probably should have connected that.
I've got all mine on my profile, and they are all about something bad happening. I just can't get away from it. I find it really hard to write happy emotions, actually. If I need to do a scene in my book that's upbeat, happy, the redemption bit, I find that really difficult. I don't know if that's just me or everyone else. Do you find the happier bits easy?
I wouldn't say I find them easy. It does seem, just from having gone through a lot of debriefs and judged a lot of these and stuff, does seem to be, people naturally seem to gravitate towards, you're always trying to get, the biggest gut punch you can, the biggest bang for your buck. You want someone to feel emotional. And I think it's easier to make the connection when it's something negative, right?
Yeah.
It's easier to kind of get in that headspace. That when someone reads about something like child death or the puppy died, right? then they're going to get emotional about it. It's kind of harder, especially in short word counts. I think the key to happy emotions is you have to build to it, right? You have to earn that happiness,
Right.
right? I think sadness can happen much more suddenly, where happiness is something that takes time to grow into. And if you're in 250 words, that's really
Yeah.
hard to do. So I think that's probably part of the challenge, from what I've seen. But I do think both can be done well, and I do think, especially, it's funny. Writing battle has been around now for a few years, and you're starting to have these veterans that have been doing it for a few years, and I think what we value has changed. I think I've seen that even in the competition in the community of we kind of respect more, like, because we've seen so many of the sad stories. When you get one that comes out that's like, oh man, this nailed that happy emotion, I think we value that more because we've kind of seen how rare those can be.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. No, that's true. Someone who can do that really well would definitely stand out. I do struggle with the. I'm someone who likes rules,
Sure.
so I
Yeah.
I struggle with the like this is the genre you need to write. Let's say you need to write romance, something which I don't think either me or you particularly want to pull out of a hat. Then when it's not in those strict genres, because when you're writing a novel, you're in a strict genre. You can't just have an alien drop down in the middle of a romance novel. No one's going to publish that. So you have these strict boundaries to an extent, and if you're going to break them, you need to be pretty good or like well known.
Right.
But in the short stories, when you're judging and you're peer judging, they move around a lot within the genre. So a story can be like, oh, this is like a winner, and you're like, well, that doesn't seem to really. I struggle with that with all the discussion and debate. I'm like, yeah, I have to not get too involved. Find that quite
Yeah,
difficult.
it's always a recurring thing on the forums. And the thing is, you don't know who's judging. In writing battle, you could have one round, you could have someone that's like a super strict rule follower, and that's like what they're really concerned about. And then the next round, you might have a judge that's like, I don't care about the rules at all. I just want a good story.
Yes.
So you kind of have to write what you enjoy and hope you get lucky a little bit.
Yeah, yeah. I have not got lucky, by the way. If anyone's wondering, how does she do? Not well. And short stories are not. But I have fun. But yeah, it's definitely not my bag long term.
That's the main thing. Have
exactly.
fun and
It's fun
and
to do.
hopefully you can take a story out of it that you can either be proud of or try to sell somewhere else or build on or whatever. And there's actually quite a few people who have taken their writing battle stories and have expanded them into longer pieces and stuff. So
Yeah, yeah. That's a nice idea.
yeah, if you're in it to win the competition, you're setting yourself up for disappointment. It's hard to win, but you never know. So there's a couple that got close. I've never made it like top 2 or anything like that. I've won my house before, which I was proud of.
Yeah, it's hard to be competitive in something like that. I heard someone say once they enjoy writing. It doesn't matter if anything happens to it or goes anywhere. They just enjoy doing
Yeah.
it. That is not me. Like if I write this novel and it doesn't go anywhere, I'm not happy about it. I don't write just for fun. I write because I want to see it published. I want to see it somewhere. I want some fruit
Yeah.
from my book. So I do enjoy writing, but not to the extent that I can sit and write stuff and then put it in a drawer and I'm happy with that. And I know some people have a different love of writing in that way. I admire them for that massively.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
I guess it's like for people like you just run and don't record what they're running for or what they're doing. It's just a different way of doing it.
Yeah, I'm somewhere in between. I have lots in the drawer, but I still have like the hope that it comes out of the drawer at some point. Like I never put something in the drawer and I'm like, I'm good with it just being in the drawer.
Yeah.
I'm okay with it being in the drawer for now, but at some point it needs to come out of the drawer.
Yeah, yeah. You need to see some reward from it. It's a lot of work.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah. Yeah, so you wrote about this loss with Logan. Have you had any other losses where you've used writing to help you through it?
So, yeah, it's 2 other articles in the blog. I think one is actually more recent than the Logan article, and I think one is possibly written right before the Logan article. So there's 3 right in a row. The most recent one is it's a loss, but it's a happy loss. I wrote a letter to an outgoing senior class. So I coach these kids starting in 7th grade, and I'm their coach for 6 years, and then they graduate and go on with life. And it's a happy thing. It's the way it's supposed to be. But, sometimes, you have a kid that you really connect with and you see them every day for 6 years, and then it's kind of happy trails, good luck. And so, yeah, I wrote, there was a class of a few kids that I was really close with that I valued a lot. And I value all my classes, but for whatever reason with this one, I just felt inspired to kind of write them a kind of going away letter, and I put it in my blog. And so I think that in a way was me processing the loss. Another one that I wrote about, this was actually, I'm trying to think if it was 2020 or 2021. It was definitely Christmas time. So yeah, this was hard. One of the kids I had coached, She had been graduated for a year, passed away in a car accident on Christmas Eve. She was 19 years old. Her name was Jessie. And so that was obviously tragic. And at the same time, my dad, who I'm very close with, had gotten COVID and ended up in the ICU for about a week. Like he was in very bad shape. And my dad can be stubborn. And it was hard because it was like convincing him to go to the hospital. And it's probably one of the most like tension-filled times I've ever had with my dad. He wasn't clear thinking with what he was going through. We had to have some hard conversations, but I remember going to the funeral of a girl I had coached for 4 years, who had tragically died at 19 years old. So I'm heartbroken over that. I'm trying to be there for the kids that were her teammates, that I had, kind of been a adult in their life, and watching them. You can't process that grief. It's especially at 18 years old, you just lost a friend, and trying to kind of grapple with those feelings. And at the same time, like I'm at that funeral, like feeling guilty because I'm checking my phone to see if my dad's okay. It was a lot to process at once. And I think at that time there was so much going on. It almost like fried your sensors. It's almost like there's so much you can't feel any of it because it's just too much coming at you at once. And I just remember kind of existing through that and not really processing any of it. And at the same time, I wasn't running much, probably just because I was emotionally fried and didn't have any energy to go out and run. But I wrote an article on there about when I came back to coaching. And actually, I think it lined up where I think this was a big part of it. Now that I haven't thought about this in a while. It's not a happy time to think about. I think we had just had Mac. So I think it was 2020. I actually hadn't seen a lot of those kids for a couple months because I had taken time off to be with my wife and our newborn son. So this all happened on Christmas Eve, and I remember coming to practice on like January 3rd or something like that. And it was the first time I had like addressed the team in several months. And it was like coming back to that and trying to like, how do I deal with this? Do I pretend like everything's normal? That doesn't seem right. What do you say? So yeah, I wrote about that whole experience, and that obviously is a pretty emotional blog. But I think once again, writing about it kind of allowed me to parse through it, feel the things I needed to feel, say what I need to say, just kind of a step in feeling what I need to feel, but also like thinking about how do I feel? Like, well, sometimes when you have to put it into words, it forces you to like dissect it a little bit more. And sometimes you gain some understanding just by forcing yourself to go through that process.
Yeah, definitely. I've had that. I started to write something down thinking I should probably write about this. And it's amazing what can come out just with pen and paper that wouldn't come out necessarily verbally when you're talking. Do you think your writing is better now because of what you've been through and maybe because of writing about it?
Definitely. It's a hard thing to articulate, but I think we all have an emotional well we kind of draw from, right? The capacity for what you can put into your characters, you have to have that capacity within yourself somewhere. So I do think when we go through the hard times, it does kind of stretch you. You feel things you've never felt before, and now you know how that feels. And so I think definitely, I think if you lived, maybe I shouldn't say it, but like, I think if you lived a perfectly like happy, boring life and never had anything bad happen to you, my guess is you'd be a pretty bad
Yeah,
writer.
I agree.
Unless you've got just an insane amount of empathy and you're just able to like put yourself in a position you've never been in. And there's definitely some of that you have to do as a writer, like especially if you're writing fiction, you have to be able to imagine what it's like to, in a situation you haven't been in. But I think if you haven't had at least some situations that are adjacent to that, it would become very hard to sound genuine and authentic as you write about it. So I think, I wouldn't wish hardship on anyone necessarily, but as a writer, I think in a weird way, we are grateful for the tough times we go through, obviously way after the fact, because there's things you learn about human nature. And let's be real, when you write fiction, your characters are going to go through hardship. Like that's part of just story structure, right? So if you've never had to deal with that, if you've never had to gone through that to feel what it feels to come on the other side of that, that's kind of the happy emotion too. It's easier to write it when you've experienced something like it before.
Definitely. You can tell sometimes in books when I read something, I think that author hasn't fully experienced that. It's just little things. But I mean, even on the podcast, we're all stories about finding hope in grief and loss. I think I'm quite empathetic. I can put myself in people's situations quite quickly. That's why I like doing the podcast, because I can ask questions about their situation, because I feel like I can put myself there. It's hard to do that if you can't. But listening to them has made me a more authentic writer when it comes to grief, because I've heard all these stories of how people have reacted with grief. So even some of them might seem a bit off the wall or a bit different, or like, would someone do that? But they are authentic, and they are things that people do, and I think people connect with that. And I really think if you're not good at it, or if you haven't experienced much, listening to other people's stories, I mean, if somebody wanted to write a scene about grief and they hadn't been through it, I would say listen to any of my podcast episodes on that topic, and you will get a very authentic idea of what it looks like, and it'll probably be different from what you would have imagined it would be. And I think that's why I just end up writing about it all the time, because it's so fresh in my mind. But also, like you said, we look at hope, and it's very hard to imagine if you haven't been through a situation. How on earth do you find hope in that kind of grief? Again, you've got to listen to someone who's been there, and like, this is how I did it. This is how I found it. And that, again, gives me kind of, not fodder. I'm not using any of your stories, by the way, listeners, for my book. But it gives me ideas as to how the human can come from one situation into another when you find it hard to imagine that yourself. It reminds me, actually, another line I really like that you wrote in your blog. I've got to find it because I wrote it down. Yeah. I've always found one of the best ways to beat your demons on the inside is to focus your attention on caring for others on the outside. It's not directly linked to what I'm saying, but it just reminded me that sometimes, focusing on others really helps you do stuff yourself. Just tell me about that. Is that something that's had a profound impact on your life? Because that's quite a strong statement.
I think when you focus on caring for other people, you're never going to feel worse.
Yeah.
You're never going to feel like I just did something nice for someone, I'm going to feel bad. So I think that's kind of and sometimes, when you're really in the thick of it, maybe it's not possible for you in that moment to be giving of yourself to someone else. But when you get to the point where you're hurting, but you just need to focus somewhere else for a while, really good place to focus is on like, what's a positive thing I can do to help someone? And in general, it's a pretty good way to live your life, probably. But yeah, I found I struggle with anxiety sometimes when I'm running. I've kind of suffered like almost panic attacks while running before. I think in the blog I was kind of going through something like that. My foot went numb on like the 8th mile of that race. It's this race that I've trained for and I've put so much into, and I've made it such an emotional thing for me because I'm in my head, I'm running with Logan, and getting to that finish line was very important. So like when there was something that put that in jeopardy, like, oh man, that was a hard moment. So what you find when you're running a marathon is you got a lot of time with your own thoughts, and sometimes you can control those thoughts more than other times. And in that moment of that race, I was not able to control what was going on inside my own head very much. So I needed to just get out of my own head. And luckily at that moment, someone I knew happened to be kind of running by me. And so rather than like, just keeping my head down and wallowing in my thoughts, hey, for half a mile, I'm going to kind of tag on with this person, and I'm just going to be there like hype man. I'm going to be positive. And it's crazy how like when you start being positive for someone else, it's just kind of easier to be positive for yourself. And sure enough, after a couple miles, I'd kind of gotten into a better headspace. But yeah, I do think that's a powerful life lesson. If we all go through ruts, we all go through difficult patches. And if you let yourself just kind of internalize everything and wallow and isolate, it's probably not a recipe for getting out of it too easily. But if you find a way to make that hard choice of, even though I'm not feeling my best, I'm going to do something positive for someone else or for the world, or I'm going to go volunteer at this place. My guess is when you come out of that, you're going to be feeling better. Not always easy to do, not always possible to do, but if you can, it's a good thing to try.
And sharing that blog afterwards, that was helping others. That was another way of you kind of looking outward from that. You had a personal best that race. It went really well. What is your personal best now?
2:45. So I beat it. Let's see. I think I've beaten that one twice now, maybe once. I can't remember. But now I'm 2:45. So I just PR'd in October again. It was at Columbus again. So I've improved. I think that one was a 2:49. So I've since gone 2:47 and 2:45. So just kind of continuously trying to get a little bit better.
So that's 2 hours, 45 minutes. What would the average person run? Because people won't know how good that is.
I think so. I think out of the 5 or 6,000 people that ran Columbus this year. The average time on the course was like 4 hours, 30 minutes.
So it's quite
So
quite a difference.
yeah, yeah. In America, we talk about mile splits a lot. So I'm basically averaging 6 minutes, 15 seconds per mile, which I don't think in Ks all that often, but I think it's about 4 minutes a K. So yeah, yeah, it's moving. I'm not like an elite runner, like I'm not a professional by any means, but for a 35-year-old dad who kind of does it on the side, it's a pretty respectable time. I'm proud of it.
It is. You've got a lot going on. I mean, I'm surprised you can even fit running and writing together as a joint thing. To be honest, that seems like a lot of
A lot
time.
of times I don't. I there is the writing part of me sometimes feels guilty where I'm like, man, if I took all the time I spent running and put that into writing, I'd probably have a couple books by now. But I don't know. They both make me happy in different ways. I kind of stumbled into something during 2020 when there was a lot of time to do some soul searching at home. I identified, I call them the 6 pillars of my life. And if I neglect any of those 6, I don't feel whole. And running and writing are 2 of the 6. So, I can go through seasons where maybe I don't run as much or I don't write as much. But if I feel like I'm completely neglecting either of those, I'm just not me. So it's kind of who I am. I'm a runner and I'm a writer, so I gotta find a way to squeeze them both in.
That feels very healthy.
Yeah, it helps me. It kind of it's even how I like organize my life. Like when I make my weekly calendar, I have my 6 categories. And if one of my categories is completely empty, I'm like, maybe I need to rethink if I'm neglecting that part of my identity right now.
So where does podcast fit in with your 6?
That's not that is a sub category of writing. The podcast was definitely it was in 2020. 2020 was a wild time.
You
And
had a lot going on.
well, here's the thing. Like I find a way to keep myself busy at all times. I'm not one to just like sit and not do something. Like I'm just always there's got to be something I'm working on. And in 2020 we couldn't go to work or go outside or do much. We were stuck at home. So I had time to do some things that I had never done before. And one of those things I'd kind of ventured into podcasting once before, but it was a very let's not talk about that. But this was my first and it was funny because John Woolley and I had worked together for a long time, and we had kind of recently discovered that we both had aspirations to become writers, but neither of us had any sort of platform at all. And we decided, why don't we both like talking? We're both teachers. We're kind of good at educating, I guess. Why don't we just try this podcast thing? I had a friend who had done a podcast, very different genre of podcast. He's a great photographer and he made a photography podcast and it had really taken off. And he had told me like, you need to, if you want to grow a platform, this is a great way to do it. You'd be good at it. So I talked to John. I was like, you want to do this? We're both sitting at home with nothing to do. And actually at the time as teachers, we had to teach ourselves a lot about like communicating virtually because all of a sudden classes were online. So like, it was kind of a natural transition. Like we're teaching online. Let's just keep it going with a podcast. And it very much started as like just kind of a fun thing we did. And it still is, but like we would get like, I don't know, 25 downloads. I think our good episodes were maybe close to 100. Like it was not something a lot of people were listening to. And it's still not like a massive podcast. Like it's definitely still kind of just a fun little thing, but it has been fun to watch it grow. And we have kind of gotten our own little community kind of tied to the competitions we do. A lot of those writers are just obsessed with those competitions. Like they when they get into one, they want to eat, sleep, and breathe it. You look at the forums while it's all going on, and so when we kind of made that connection, all of a sudden it's like, wait, there's a podcast that talks about this thing I'm obsessed with, and it's been kind of fun to connect with some people that way.
It's a good niche for that. You've kind of found a nice little groove there. If for people who are listening who, are going through stuff and they haven't ever thought about writing, not necessarily writing, fiction and stuff, but just writing in any way, shape or form, why should people consider it? Why should people think about writing? What's the benefits?
So I think one thing I would say right off the bat is we all write way more than we realize anyways, especially in the age of social media. A lot of us are writing captions or comments and you write more than you realize. Even if it's work emails, you're constantly having to put your thoughts into words. So I guess some advice is like, especially if you're going through something, like just put your thoughts into words, even if it's just in a notebook on your nightstand. And maybe you try it a few times and you don't like it. And that's perfectly fine. But I do think there's power in just taking a moment to feel what you're feeling, and then thinking about it enough to put it on a page, there's naturally going to be some processing that happens there. And in my opinion, that's usually pretty healthy processing. It does give you some measure of allowing you to feel your feelings in a safe space. If you don't want to share it, you never have to share it. It can just be your own little thing. But I think an important step with dealing with loss or grief or pain or whatever is allowing yourself to feel it and allowing yourself to think and process it when you're ready to. And I think writing is just a very natural way of doing that. It takes time. So you're having to spend time feeling that, getting in that headspace. And then you have to attach words to it. So you have to think enough about it to articulate it, to understand it. I think that's why it's good. Whatever's comfortable for you, it's different for everyone, I'm sure. If it's writing a letter to yourself, if it's writing a blog, if it's writing a diary, if it's telling fictional stories, but the stories deal with something adjacent to that you went through. I think there's just anytime you allow yourself to be in that space, feel it, think about it, I think that's a healthy step.
Definitely. And there's so many different ways to do it. Like you said, it could be any of those, or it could be poetry. And there's all sorts of these short story communities that I didn't know anything about. If you want to feel like you're in it with other people, then writing in these ways and joining the forums and seeing people talk about it can really help you not only kind of hone your craft, but also just you're less alone in it. So I think that, there's a whole world out there for people who are interested in it. And some people might just want to write and put it in a drawer, which is absolutely fine. Loads of ways. So writing is a useful tool for dealing with loss and grief, and for people going through it, but also maybe people preparing for it. Some people can write about these things, put themselves there, imagine it. That can actually help you when you go through it, maybe. So with my last question and my metaphorical tool shed, if I was to go in and pick out a tool that represented writing and how that can help us in these situations, what kind of tool do you think it would be?
So I hope this counts as a tool. I'm not much of a gardener. I'm going to go with some gloves, though. Some good heavy-duty gardening gloves. Because, first of all, it can fit to whatever you need. All right? If it's one size fits all a little bit. But then it allows you to get in the weeds, right? It allows you to get into that hard thing, right? Feel what you need to feel, exist with it. But it protects you. There's a buffer, right? You can talk about it in a way that feels safe. If you want to, you can attach it to a character that's not you. If you want to write fiction, you can, let's use my example with Logan. If I wanted to, I could have written a story about a father whose wife just had a miscarriage, and I could have made it all fictional, and it's not me. But obviously, if I wrote that story, I'd be forced to feel a lot of what I had to feel, right? But it's not happening to me. It's happening to Bob, So I think writing allows you to exist with and approach those feelings that you need to feel, but it just gives you a little layer of protection where it's maybe not quite as fresh, not quite as sharp. So that's the gloves. You're still pulling the weeds, but your fingers aren't going to get all caught up or cut up and scratched up because you've got that layer of protection there as you're doing the work that needs to be done. And it's hard work, so you got to put your gloves on.
Gloves. Every gardener knows you need a good few pairs of those in the shed. And for the toughest jobs, you need the heavy-duty ones. I had a feeling Justin, as a creative, would come up with a great analogy, and he didn't disappoint. He's absolutely right. Writing is like a protective layer. It gives you a safe space to process your experiences, shields you from sharing before you're ready, and allows you to explore your emotions in a way that might truly surprise you. If you haven't tried it before, I urge you to give it a go. If you want to find out more about Justin and his writing, you can check out justincreps.com, and I'll put links in the show notes to the blog posts that he mentioned and his podcast and social media. Thank you so much for this conversation, Justin. It was so good to chat about two subjects that are so close to my heart, and I'm hopeful this will encourage a lot more people to process what they're going through writing, even if you do just put it in a drawer afterwards. And thanks for listening to the Silent Why podcast. If you've got a subject you'd like me to chat to an expert on, please get in touch via social media or the website, or drop me an email, thesilentwhy@gmail.com. And let's chat.